You picked the wrong night to be difficult. Dale Miller had just told a quiet woman in a government holding room that she had no way out. What Dale Miller did not know, what no one in that airless, buzzing fluorescent room understood, was that the woman sitting across from him had been building a federal case against this exact port of entry for 14 months. Every second he kept her here, every form he falsified, every camera angle he thought he'd blocked, was another brick in a wall that was about to fall on him. He reached across the table and lifted her bag. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He just picked it up, one-handed, like it already belonged to him. The bag swung once. The metal zipper caught the light. She watched him with her eyes only. And that single motion, a man's hand on something that wasn't his, was where it started. If you've watched someone walk into a trap they set for themselves, stay right here. This story doesn't go where you think it does. The secondary inspection room at the international terminal had no windows. It had two doors, one leading back toward primary customs, one leading deeper into the port facility, and a single pane of frosted glass set into the wall that separated it from the cargo corridor outside. The glass was thick enough to muffle voices, but thin enough to let shadows through. There were 3 rows of hard plastic chairs, a table bolted to the floor on a steel plate, and an overhead camera mounted near the ceiling vent at an angle that faced the primary door rather than the center of the room. That angle was not an accident. Dale Miller had submitted a written request 18 months ago for the camera to be repositioned, citing an obstruction in his sightline to the processing table. The facility's coordinator, who had no particular reason to investigate the claim, had approved the adjustment within 48 hours. The new angle ensured that the center of the room, where the inspection table sat and where detained passengers were questioned, existed in a narrow dead zone between the camera's field of view and the secondary table where Miller typically stood. From the camera's perspective, most of what happened at the primary inspection table registered as partial, a shoulder, a hand, the edge of a form, without context. Miller knew this. He had tested it. He had stood in different positions throughout the room and checked the footage afterward, learning the geometry of invisibility the same way he had learned everything useful in his career, not through rules, but through their edges. He had been a CBP officer for 11 years. The room was his. Or it had been. The fluorescent tube above the central table buzzed at a low, persistent frequency that fell just below the threshold of active irritation. It had been buzzing like that for 6 months. Miller had never filed a maintenance request. The sound was useful. People sitting under a buzzing light for extended periods began to feel a mild, unnameable discomfort that they could not trace to any single cause, which made them easier to manage. That was Miller's word for it. Management. It was 11:23 in the evening when Reyna Okafor was escorted through the door. She came in the way travelers come in when they have been awake for 16 hours and still have somewhere to be. Not defeated, not energized, simply present. She wore dark trousers and a gray long-sleeve shirt, a single carry-on bag worn crossbody across her chest, a small watch on her left wrist. No jewelry beyond that. Hair pulled back in a clean knot at the base of her skull. The kind of appearance that disappears in a crowd, that offers nothing to remember and nothing to dismiss, that occupies space without announcing itself. She took the chair closest to the door without being told. Set her bag flat across her lap, both hands resting on the strap. Then she looked at the room. She did it in one slow, complete sweep. Ceiling first. The camera in the corner, its angle, the precise arc of its coverage. Both doors, the primary and the secondary, their hinges, which way they opened. The frosted glass and the shadow of the corridor beyond it. The table's bolt plate on the floor. The intercom panel near the secondary door. The notice posted on the far wall in its government-issue plastic frame. She read the notice. It was printed on pale yellow paper, with a blue federal border and the official CBP seal centered at the top. CBP Passenger Rights Notice. Issued pursuant to 8 CFR Section 235.3, the federal regulation governing procedures for extended detention at ports of entry. There were 6 bullet-pointed rights in plain language. The 4th bullet stated, without ambiguity, that any passenger held in extended secondary inspection was entitled to written notification of the specific grounds for their continued detention, provided within a reasonable time and upon request. She read all 6. She did it in the first 40 seconds. She read the way someone reads a document they already know and are verifying against memory. Short, deliberate eye movements, landing on key phrases rather than reading left to right across every word. The posture of a person conducting a check rather than receiving information. When she finished, she settled back. Her hands relaxed on the bag strap. Not clasped, not gripping. Loose. The stillness that came over her then was not the stillness of submission or resignation. It was the stillness of a person who has assessed an environment and decided, with precision, how to move through it. Harold Osei had been sitting in the room for 43 minutes by the time she arrived. He was 58 years old, a professor of economics at a university in Atlanta, returning from a 3-day academic conference in Accra. He had a colleague's business card in his breast pocket that he had been turning over in his fingers for the last 20 minutes, not reading it, just turning it, the way people handle small objects when they need something to do with their hands that isn't slamming them against a wall. His blazer was folded across his knees. A compression travel pillow, deflated flat, sat on the chair beside him. The primary inspector had given him no explanation for the secondary referral beyond a 2-word notation on the dispatch screen. Secondary review. 2 words. No statute cited. No specific concern articulated. Just secondary review. When Raina sat down, he looked at her with the measuring, exhausted look of a man who has been doing the same arithmetic for 43 minutes and keeps arriving at the same answer. Then he said it quietly, without preamble, the way you state a fact that no longer surprises you. They do this every week. No one answered him. He hadn't expected them to. The flight had arrived at Gate C-12 at 11:04 that evening, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. It was an international route operating on a narrow-body aircraft, and the early arrival was not unusual. The crews had long since learned to pad the departure schedule from the origin city to absorb gate delays, with the result that they frequently arrived slightly early on the far end. The terminal was operating at a reduced overnight staffing level, which meant the customs hall was processing passengers through 4 of its 12 booths. Raina had deplaned in the last third of the aircraft. Not the back, not the front. The third where you're not first off and not last off and nobody remembers where you were sitting. She carried 1 bag on and 1 bag off. She had not checked luggage. She had not used the seatback entertainment system. For the first hour of the flight she had read, a physical book, not a screen, the kind that leaves a slight indent on the fingers if held open long enough. For the middle 3 hours she had slept, upright, without a neck pillow, her head not touching the window or the headrest of the seat beside her, but resting against her own shoulder in a practiced angle that suggested she had solved the problem of sleeping while seated many years ago. For the final 40 minutes she had looked out the window at the grid of city lights below. In the customs hall, she had taken a position 7 people back from the primary inspection booths. The line moved in the irregular rhythm of all customs lines. 2 passengers fast, 1 slow, a brief pause when a document required additional scanning, then 3 more through. She watched the rhythm without impatience. She watched it the way you watch traffic when you're waiting to cross, not anxious for your turn, simply tracking the pattern. Before she reached the booth, she adjusted the strap on her crossbody bag. The motion was small, the kind that happens in any crowd, but the strap had not slipped. It was sitting exactly where she'd placed it coming off the aircraft. She reached up and adjusted it anyway, finding the buckle by touch without looking down, shifting the length 2 clicks, then 2 clicks back, returning it to its exact original position. The motion was not about comfort. It was about verification. A systems check, run the same way every time, not because anything was wrong, but because the habit of checking had been grooved so deeply into her, it activated automatically before entering any controlled or unfamiliar environment. She stepped up to booth 6. The primary inspector, a man named Broussard, 20-year veteran, who processed passengers with the practiced speed of someone who has shaken hands with indifference so many times it has become a form of expertise, scanned her passport, matched the photo, ran the biometric, and reached for the stamp. The terminal beeped, a soft sound. Administrative infrequency. The kind of alert that is designed to sound routine so that neither the inspecting officer nor the waiting passengers behind treat it as an event. Broussard looked at his screen. He looked at Reyna. He looked at the screen again. "Step to your left, ma'am. Secondary inspection." He said it without looking up. His hand was already moving toward the next passenger's documents. Reyna picked up her bag and stepped left. She did not change her expression. She did not look back. Dale Miller arrived in the secondary inspection room 8 minutes after she did. He walked in without knocking. There was no procedure requiring a knock, and he had never knocked anyway. He moved directly to the secondary table at the back of the room with the unhurried proprietary ease of a man entering his own kitchen. He opened a folder. He glanced at the two occupants of the chairs, Osei first, then Reyna, a brief categorizing look, the kind that sorts rather than sees, and he returned to the folder without acknowledging either of them. He was tall, with the build of a man who had been genuinely strong in his 30s, and now carried the memory of that strength in his posture without always being able to back it with the substance. His uniform was pressed and correct. His name tag sat at a precise angle on his left breast pocket, D. Miller Officer, CBP. He had a gold supervisor's stripe on his sleeve that he had earned 7 years ago. He had not earned anything above it since. 11 years in this building. He knew its rhythms and its silences and its gaps the way old sailors know a particular stretch of coastline. Not from charts, but from having moved through it in every kind of weather. 2 minutes after Miller sat down, Diane Caldwell came through the primary door. She was the supervisory officer on the evening shift. She had held that position for 4 years, and she had navigated those 4 years through a combination of institutional loyalty, careful alliance maintenance, and a talent for making the uncomfortable seem manageable. She walked in smiling, which was something Miller never did. Her smile was the specific kind that operates on 2 levels simultaneously, warm enough at the surface to read as genuine, careful enough at the structure to communicate that things were under control. Both readings were accurate. "Let's get everyone sorted," she said, to the general room, in the general direction of both detained passengers, while her eyes found Reyna and stayed there for half a second longer than neutral. "These things take a little longer at night. We'll get you on your way." Her voice had the texture of someone who genuinely believed they were performing a service. That was the thing about Diane Caldwell that made her valuable to Miller's operation. She wasn't pretending to be kind. She believed that efficient procedure, even improperly applied procedure, applied with good intentions, was its own form of decency. She had never questioned the pattern of cases that came through this room, because she had never sat with the pattern long enough to see what it was. Reyna met Caldwell's eyes briefly and nodded once. She did not say thank you. Preston Hale came in 1 minute after Caldwell with his clipboard held flat against his forearm the way lawyers carry briefs to court. He was the technical inspector on the shift, the one responsible for the paperwork architecture of a secondary detention. He managed the forms and cross-references and database entries that built the official legal record of why a person was being held and what had been found and what authorization existed for each step. He sat down across from Reyna, placed his clipboard on the table, uncapped his pen, and began working through the intake protocol with the focused efficiency of a man who considers each item a task to be completed. Citizenship, confirmed. Country of travel, stated. Duration of trip, stated. Purpose of trip, stated. And the specific nature of the business activity during the travel period? Logistics review, Reyna said. International contract review. Hale wrote. His pen moved in tight, economical strokes. The client name, if applicable, The client relationships are covered under non-disclosure agreements. I've disclosed the category of business activity on my declaration form, which is what the form requires. For our records, if you could, I've disclosed what the form requires. I'm not going to provide additional information that I have a contractual obligation not to disclose in an informal verbal setting. Hale wrote something on the clipboard. The pen pressed slightly harder than it had been pressing. Miller came back to the table at 11:41. He pulled a chair around so that he sat at the corner rather than directly across, a positioning that partially blocked Rayna's direct sight line to the primary door, not by much, but enough to register in the geography of the room. He leaned back. He folded his arms. He watched Rayna with an expression that had replaced whatever operational face he usually wore with something older and more personal. "Let me ask you something directly," he said. She looked at him. "What's the actual purpose of this trip?" "I answered that in the declaration form and in the verbal questions just concluded. I'm asking you again." "I gave you an accurate answer. Asking it a second time doesn't create a different answer. It just documents that you've asked the same question twice." Miller's jaw shifted. A small movement, barely perceptible, the kind of adjustment a person makes when they expected a particular response and didn't receive it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Where do you live?" She gave her city. "You always travel alone?" "I travel as my work requires." "No family expecting you?" "I don't see how that's relevant to this inspection." "I'm trying to get a full picture." "The full picture is on my declaration form. I've answered every question within it accurately. I'm not going to extend the scope of this inquiry beyond what's procedurally required." Miller unfolded his arms and leaned forward on the table. He had the quality of a man who has been told no before and has always found a route around it. You know, people who don't have anything to hide usually don't have a problem just talking. "And people who follow proper procedure," Rayna said, "don't have a problem with others following it too." Miller looked at her for 3 full seconds. Harold Osei had set his travel pillow down. The question about her phone came 12 minutes into the session. Miller stood up and moved to stand beside her chair rather than across from it. The standing beside, rather than across, being a deliberate shift, a change in the physical logic of the room that placed him in a position of elevation and proximity simultaneously. He looked at the bag in her lap. "Open the bag." "Is this a formal border search?" "It's secondary inspection. Open the bag." "I'm not refusing. I'm asking for the legal basis to be stated for the record before the search proceeds. Under 19 U.S.C. Section 1582, routine border searches don't require a warrant. I understand that. I want the basis on the record," Hale wrote on his clipboard. Miller looked at Hale and then back at Rayna. The look he gave Hale was very brief and said nothing that could be quoted later. "Open the bag," Miller said again. She opened it. Everything inside was standard and consistent with what any legitimate business traveler might carry. Travel documents in a zippered pouch. A charging cable, coiled and rubber-banded. A book. A physical one, with a library receipt tucked inside as a bookmark. The receipt dated 3 weeks prior. A cloth toiletry bag, zipped closed. A small spiral notepad. A pen. 2 compression sleeves for long-haul flights, folded and packed in a small mesh bag. A set of keys on a plain ring with no tags or identifiers. Miller went through each item with his fingers. He handled the toiletry bag and squeezed it along its seams. He turned the notepad over. He flipped through the book without reading it. He pulled the charging cable out of its coil, checked both ends, put it back. Then he picked up the phone. It was a standard model. No case. Fully charged. Password? Under Riley v. California, 573 U.S. 373, the Supreme Court held that law enforcement cannot compel access to cell phone contents without a warrant, even in a border context, absent specific exigent circumstances. I'm not aware of any exigent circumstances here. If you're asserting a specific exception, I'd like that exception stated and documented. Miller looked at her. This is a border search. The Supreme Court specifically addressed border search doctrine in that decision. The holding was that cell phones are different in kind from physical items, given the nature and volume of personal data they contain. If you have a warrant, I'll comply. If you're asserting a narrow exception, I'd like the basis stated. She looked at Hale. I want that documented in the session record. Miller took the phone. He placed it in a labeled evidence bag. He wrote her name across the front and the case number that Hale supplied. He set it on the edge of the table, out of her reach, and he did not state a legal basis, and he did not write one on the bag. The word she had used was specific, documented. Not complained, not objected. Documented. The vocabulary of a person who understands that what gets written down is what exists, and that the paper trail, who said what, in what order, under what authority, is not a record of events, but the battlefield on which events get adjudicated later. Miller had heard people protest before. He had heard people threaten to call lawyers and make complaints and write letters. The protest always had a certain quality, a rising pitch, an emotional edge, the tremor of someone who knows the rules exist but has never handled them as instruments. This was different. There was no tremor. There was no emotional edge. There was precision. There was the quiet, methodical establishment of a record. He moved away from the table. He moved away, and he did not look at Osai, who was watching him with the careful, appraising attention of a man who has seen this exact pattern before and knows which moment this is, and knows, because he has seen it many times, that the next several hours will follow a particular logic that does not require anyone to raise their voice. Outside, through the frosted glass, the corridor beyond the secondary inspection area was quiet. At 11:41, a mass of shadow moved in the corridor beyond the glass. It was large and rectangular, and it backed into position and became still. The lights that had been on while it was moving went dark before the vehicle fully stopped. Not after. Before. Rayna's eyes moved to the frosted glass. She noted the shadow. She noted the time on the wall clock. She noted the sequence, light, then movement, then darkness before stillness. She returned her attention to the room. Marcus Teal had not yet arrived, but the truck was there, and its lights had gone out before it stopped, which is not how you park a vehicle when you want to be seen, and not how you arrive when your presence is something you want documented. She said nothing. She filed it. Diane Colwell returned at 11:52. She came in without the clipboard and without the official posture. She pulled a chair around and sat beside Rayna the way you sit beside someone at a kitchen table, turned slightly toward them, hands on her own knee, head tilted, close enough that the dynamic shifted from interrogation to something that was supposed to feel like confidence. I know this has been a long evening, she said. Rayna looked at her. I just want to make sure we're doing this right, for everyone. The warmth was at full wattage. Are you doing okay? Is there anything you need? I'd like my phone returned, and I'd like to be told the specific legal basis for this continued detention. I understand. We're working through the process. Colwell tilted her head slightly more. Do you have family waiting? Someone who might be wondering where you are? That's not relevant to this inspection. I know. Colwell's expression communicated patient understanding. We try to be aware of the human side of these things. Traveling alone at night, coming through international. It can be a lot. The pause was carefully placed. We just want to make sure everything is what it appears to be. What specifically doesn't appear to be what it is? Rayna asked. Colwell smiled. Nothing in particular. That's just the purpose of secondary review, making sure everything checks out completely. Then what specifically prompted this secondary referral? The primary inspector applied Code Alpha 7. I'd like the basis for that code's application entered into the session record. The smile held, but underwent a microscopic adjustment in the muscles around Colwell's eyes. The secondary referral is generated automatically based on Code Alpha 7 is not an automatic algorithmic designation. It requires manual input from the processing officer at Primary. I'd like the basis for that manual input documented. She looked at Hale, who was at the far table. I'm asking for that clearly, on the record. Hale looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked at Hale. I'll look into it, Caldwell said, with unchanged warmth, and stood up and crossed to the secondary table and wrote something on a form without explaining what she was writing. Harold Osai had been watching the exchange with the attention of a man taking notes he will never put on paper. He looked at Raina from the corner of his eye. He looked at Caldwell's back at the secondary table. He turned the business card over in his fingers twice and set it down on the chair beside him. Preston Hale returned to the Primary table at 23 minutes past midnight with a new form. He placed it in front of Raina with the methodical care of someone performing a procedural step that they have performed many times before. He set a pen beside it. The form was printed on official CBP stock, the government seal at the top, the case number in a smaller font below, the bold header reading, Supplemental Customs Declaration, Form 6059, B. He indicated the relevant section with a single tap of his finger on the paper. This needs to be completed and signed to close the secondary inspection file. Raina looked at the form. She began reading it. Hale watched. Miller was at the secondary table with his back to the room, doing something with a folder. Caldwell was near the far door. The fluorescent tube buzzed. The air did not move. Raina read Section 7B. She read it once. Then she went back and read it again. Then she lifted the form from the table and read it aloud. Not dramatically. Not with inflection. Evenly, the way you read a discrepancy to another person when you want them to hear it clearly. Section 7B. Purpose of visit. Domestic client consultations. Advisory services. Domestic market. She placed the form flat on the table and looked at Hale. My original declaration form states the purpose of my trip as Logistics Review, International Contract. Those entries are not the same. They describe different activities in different geographic scopes. This form has been pre-populated with a different purpose than the one I declared. This is a clarification form, Hale said. It's meant to... It doesn't clarify my original entry. It replaces it with a different entry. She turned the form so it faced him. I'm not going to sign a federal declaration that contains a factual inaccuracy. If you prepare a corrected version that accurately reflects my original declaration, I'll sign that immediately. The form was prepared based on the inspection file's current entries. Then the inspection file contains an error that needs to be corrected before I sign anything. I'm flagging that error clearly and on the record. She looked at Hale's clipboard. I'd like the time noted, 12:07 a.m. Hale wrote the time. Miller turned around from the secondary table. He crossed the room in 5 steps and stopped 2 feet from Raina's chair. He was standing over her. He had the height and the practiced use of it that some men develop when they learn that physical presence can substitute for argument. He looked at her for a long moment. You are making this significantly harder than it needs to be. Signing an inaccurate federal document would expose me to potential liability for false declaration under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. Declining to sign it is not obstruction, it's self-protection, and it's the correct procedure. It is if I say it is. The room went quiet. Then she said carefully, I'd like that statement entered into the record as well. Officer Miller, badge number D. Miller stated, and I'm quoting precisely, it is if I say it is. The time is 12:08 a.m. Hale's pen was moving. Miller looked at Hale. His expression communicated a specific and silent message. Hale's pen did not stop. Hale had been writing things down all night. He would continue to write things down. It was his job, and he intended to keep doing it. What he chose to record, and what he chose to omit, were his professional judgment calls, and he was beginning to find that those calls were becoming more complicated than they had been 2 hours ago. What happened at 12:11 a.m. was small, and it was enormous. Miller had picked up the supplemental form, not carefully, with the abrupt and dismissive motion of a man ending a conversation on his own terms, and in sweeping it from the table, his forearm moved across the surface with enough force to send Rayna's water bottle off the edge. Whether it was intentional was a question of interpretation. The motion had the quality of something both deliberate and deniable, which is the quality that most useful acts of intimidation share. The bottle hit the floor, bounced, rolled until it contacted the base of the wall. Miller did not acknowledge it. He turned and walked to the secondary table. Rayna watched the bottle reach the wall and come to rest. She did not move to retrieve it. She looked at Hale, who was looking at his clipboard. She looked at Caldwell, who was looking at a point somewhere between the wall and the door that contained no useful information. She looked at the bottle. Then she looked at the camera. She held the camera in her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for anyone reviewing the footage later to understand that she had registered the moment, evaluated it, and placed it in a category. Then she returned her attention to Miller's back. "I want it noted for the record," she said, "that at 12:11 a.m., a personal item was removed from the inspection table without my consent and without being entered into the evidence log. Officer Hale, please record that notation." Hale wrote. Miller, at the secondary table, did not turn around. Yolanda Reese was standing at the far corner of the room. She had been stationed there for the last 25 minutes, a junior officer on the evening shift assigned to this room, while her supervisor worked a more complex inspection in the adjacent facility. She was 26 years old and 8 months into the job, and she had received no specific instructions for this assignment beyond stay available in case assistance is required. She had taken that assignment and made it specific. She had been taking notes, not on an official form, in her own notebook, the one she carried in her left breast pocket for her own professional purposes, the one she had started at the beginning of her second week on the job when she realized that the official log did not always contain the information she would need if she ever had to explain what she had witnessed. She wrote, 12:11 a.m. Item swept from table. Not logged. She wrote, Miller, D. Did not acknowledge. She underlined both lines. Marcus Teal arrived at 12:21. He knocked twice and opened the door before anyone responded, which was different from Miller, who never knocked at all, and different from Caldwell, who knocked and waited. Teal's "to-knock then enter" was its own kind of message. I'm observing the formality, but it's a gesture, not a genuine deference. He was in his mid-40s, compact, with the economic physicality of a person who moves efficiently because they've learned to spend nothing they don't have to. He was the airport's security coordination liaison, not a CBP officer, but the interface between the port facility's private security infrastructure and the federal inspection operations. His access card worked on both systems. He had a printed sheet in his hand. He crossed to Miller and handed it over without speaking. Miller read it. Something in his posture shifted, a small, almost invisible loosening, the way a person's frame relaxes when they receive confirmation of something they were waiting to hear. He brought the sheet to the primary table and placed it in front of Rayna. It was an anonymous tip report, generated through the CBP tip intake system, formatted on standard template paper, with a case intake number at the top and the submission timestamp in the upper right corner. The timestamp read 10:47 p.m. Rayna picked up the form with both hands. She read it. Her eyes moved to the wall clock, then back to the timestamp. She set the form flat on the table and smoothed it with her palm. This tip was received at 10:47 p.m., she said. Miller leaned against the table edge, arms folded, waiting. My flight landed at 11:21 p.m. She looked at the form. This report was submitted 34 minutes before my aircraft touched down at this terminal. She placed both palms flat on the table, mirroring his posture without matching his force. I want the dispatch confirmation number and the submitting terminal ID for this tip entered into the session record. I'm requesting that clearly and on the record right now. Hale's pen had paused above his clipboard for the first time since the session began. Teal was near the door. He had not moved since handing the sheet to Miller. He was watching Reyna with an expression that had nothing to do with hostility or confidence. It was the expression of a person who has encountered a deviation from a plan and is running the deviation's implications through a rapid and private calculation. Miller straightened up. He walked to Reyna's chair and stopped close enough that she would have had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact if she had wanted to. She didn't tilt. She looked forward. "You know what I think?" he said low. "I think you came through here with something you shouldn't have. And I think you figured out quick that making noise, throwing out legal terms, writing things in your little notepad, might be your best way to distract from that." He let the silence work for a moment. "It won't work here. I've seen it before. I know what it looks like." He bent slightly toward her. "So does everyone else in this room." She looked at him steadily. "Then you shouldn't have any trouble documenting the basis for this detention and every action taken during it. People with nothing to hide, to borrow your phrase, don't have a problem with accurate records." Miller's face was very still. Osei had set down the business card. He was looking at Miller with something that had passed beyond patience into the particular territory that opens up on the other side of it. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something older and more specific than either. "3 people I know have come through this room in the last 4 weeks, Osei said. He said it without particular urgency, the way you say something that is simply true and has been true long enough to stop requiring justification. All of them traveling alone. All of them with light luggage. None of them with anything. None of them were charged. None of them got an explanation." He looked at his hands. "I'll testify to that if it's ever useful." Miller looked at him. "Sir, you're here for a secondary review, not commentary." Osei looked at his watch. "It has been 119 minutes, he said, "for a routine secondary review." He said nothing else. But he didn't look away. Sud. This story is about to get significantly more serious. What happens in the next hour is why that truck outside has its lights off. Don't stop here. It was Caldwell who formalized the body search order at 12:33 a.m. She did it with appropriate official language, citing the border search exception under 19 U.S.C., Section 1582. Her voice maintaining the careful warmth that was her professional signature. Within the narrow geography of the inspection area, technically, the citation was defensible. But the border search exception has limits that Caldwell's confident tone skipped over, specifically that the extent and nature of the search must be calibrated to reasonable suspicion, and that after 2 hours of inspection yielding nothing, the threshold for escalation was higher than a tip report with a timestamp that predated the passenger's arrival by 34 minutes. None of that was in the room's official record. The record showed secondary review, tip report received, supplemental form declined, body search authorized. "I'm not refusing the search," Reyna said. "I want a female officer to conduct the physical inspection. I want all items handled under direct observation, and I want a complete inventory entered into the official log, item by item, before and after. Those are standard procedural requests." Caldwell nodded. Of course. Reese was directed to conduct the physical inspection. Reese did it by the book. She was thorough, professional, and careful. She worked through the inventory form item by item, describing each object in plain language and noting its condition. Clothing, travel documents, electronic device, currently in evidence custody. Book, described with title. Toiletry items, listed individually. Notepad, described as personal journal, no official markings. Keys, compression sleeves, charging cable. When she finished, she wrote at the bottom of the inventory sheet in her neat, even hand, "No items of concern identified." She signed it. Yolanda Reese, CBP officer. Date and time, 12:41 a.m. Miller took the sheet. He read it. He set it on the secondary table. "Subject remains uncooperative," he said to Hale, who wrote it down. Osei stood up. He stood up without announcing it, just rose from his chair, steady, and looked at Miller. She has answered every question. She has complied with every lawful request. She has been in this room for over 2 hours. His voice was calm and even. I have been in this room for over 2.5 hours. I have watched this entire session. I do not see what you see when you use that word. Sit down, sir. I'll note. Sit. Down. Osei sat down. But the thing he'd said was, in the room now. It had been stated in front of a camera and a junior officer with a notebook. It had been said clearly by a 58-year-old professor from Atlanta who had been detained for 2.5 hours for no documented reason, and who had decided, at this particular moment, that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speech. Miller looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned away. The confrontation at the table came at 12:47 a.m. It did not arrive with a raised voice or a drawn weapon. It arrived with Dale Miller pushing back from the secondary table and crossing the room in the quiet, controlled way of a man who has made a decision and is executing it. He stopped behind Raina's chair and to her right, in the position you take when you want someone to feel your presence behind them without being able to see you directly. He put his hand on her shoulder. Not hard, just the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the physical grammar of a certain kind of authority. The message was specific. I can touch you. You cannot stop me from touching you. The next question is whether you understand that. You are going to cooperate fully with the remainder of this inspection, he said, or you are going to find out what the rest of tonight looks like. Take your hand off me. Ma'am, take your hand off me. I am making that request clearly on the record right now. He left his hand in place. 3 seconds. 4. He was measuring the response, waiting for the flinch, the small physical concession that communicates acceptance of the hierarchy. Most people gave it without knowing they had. It was automatic. It was the body responding to proximity and weight and the knowledge of institutional authority before the mind caught up. She didn't give it. She didn't move forward or back. Her breathing didn't change. Her hand stayed on the table. He removed his hand. He moved around to the front of the table. He set both palms flat on the surface and leaned forward, his face close to hers. You think the notes are going to matter, he said, very low. The little objections, the little requests for documentation. You think that's going to protect you? He held position. This is my room. Those notes don't leave with you tonight. She looked at him. She said nothing. He straightened up. He looked at Teal, who had come back from the corridor 9 minutes earlier and was standing near the secondary door. Something passed between them. A look. A shared calculation. Teal gave a small nod. Miller turned back to Raina. Stand up. She stood. He reached for her arm, not her shoulder this time, her arm, above the elbow, with the grip of a man who intends to move a person from one location to another and has used this grip before and knows what it produces. He pulled. The motion was designed to take her off balance, to use her own weight against her forward momentum, to establish in a single physical moment what hours of verbal exchange had failed to establish. What it was not designed to produce was what it produced. She moved with the pull, not against it, with it. Her weight shifted forward and down simultaneously, redistributing through her hips in a way that neutralized the off-balance effect completely. The pull that was supposed to create a stumble became a pivot, and at the end of the pivot, she was standing 2 feet from where she'd been, on her own feet, the motion complete, the direction of force fully absorbed and redirected through trained mechanics so natural they looked like nothing. Not a stumble, not a catch, a choice. Miller blinked. His hand was in the air where her arm had been. He had done this before. He had done it in this room, and in adjacent rooms, and in other buildings, and he knew the physics of it. Or he thought he did. Bodies stumbled. Bodies caught themselves on the edge of the table or went down. He had documentation for both outcomes. He had used the documentation. She was standing in the middle of the room looking at him with an expression that communicated nothing except attention. Her shirt was barely creased. Harold Osei had straightened in his chair. He had stopped breathing for a moment and then started again. He was looking at her with eyes that had changed, and the question he had been carrying for the last 20 minutes arrived in his throat as a single word. Military? It was barely audible. It was one word, quiet enough to be below the threshold of the audio equipment's confident capture. She glanced at him. One beat. She smoothed the front of her shirt and returned her attention to Miller. She did not answer the question. Miller grabbed her again. This time there was no calculation in it. He grabbed her with both hands and pulled, moving her toward the secondary table at the back of the room. The motion was faster and harder than the first, the physics of a man substituting force for precision. She moved with it again, the pivot, the weight transfer. But the table edge was there, and her thigh made contact with the corner as she was turned. She absorbed it on the outer muscle, bracing in the fraction of a second before impact, the kind of structural adjustment that happens below conscious thought in a body that has had that fraction of a second trained into it over years and years and years. She did not make a sound. Miller released her and stepped back. He was breathing differently. Not heavily, control was still present, but differently. The altered rhythm of a man recalibrating under pressure he had not anticipated and working to keep the recalibration private. Yolanda Reese was on her feet. She had not decided to stand. Her body had stood while her mind was still catching up. Her notepad was in her left hand. Her right hand was at her side, very still. "Officer Miller." Her voice was quiet, professional. But it was there, in the room, said clearly. Miller turned and looked at her. Reese said nothing more. She held his gaze. Then, slowly, so that the action was visible to everyone in the room, she brought her pen to the notepad and began writing. Miller looked at the notepad. He looked at Reese for a long time. She did not look away, and she did not stop writing. Then he looked at Teal. Teal's phone was in his hand. He checked it. Whatever was supposed to be happening in Loading Bay 7 was not happening on the schedule they had planned. Whatever was parked outside in the dark had been sitting still for over an hour, which was longer than any routine unloading operation required, and longer than any plausible explanation could comfortably cover. Caldwell had her arms folded and was examining a section of wall to her left that held no information. Hale presented the corrected supplemental form at 1:17 a.m. It was, in fact, a different form. Same stock, same header, same case number, but the pre-populated fields had been changed. Section 7B now read, in the revised version, International Logistics Advisory and Contract Review, which was, superficially, closer to Reyna's original declaration. But line 4 of Section 9, the section covering duration and financial scope of the contracted activity, had been filled in with a figure that was 17 times larger than the amount she had declared on her entry form. Not an error of formatting. Not a rounding difference, 17 times larger. She read the form through once. Then she set it flat on the table. Section 7B has been corrected, she said to Hale. Thank you. However, the figure in line 4 of Section 9 does not correspond to my declaration. The declared figure on my entry form is, and she stated it precisely, and this form shows a substantially different amount. That's not a clarification. That's a new error. Hale's expression did not change. He took the form back. He looked at line 4 of Section 9. He looked at the entry form on his clipboard. He looked at line 4 again. It appears there may have been a transcription issue. Then it needs to be corrected before I sign. Miller had come back to the table. His voice had lost whatever remained of its professional register. Sign the form. When it's accurate. Sign the form. I've explained why I won't sign an inaccurate federal declaration. That explanation is on the record. I'm not going to give you a different answer because you've asked 3 times. Miller picked up the form from the table. He held it for a moment. Then he brought it down flat on the table's surface with the full force of his forearm. Not at her. Next to her, the impact 2 inches from her folded hands, hard enough to rattle the table in its bolted base and send Hale's pen rolling off the edge to the floor. The sound was flat and hard and final in the small room. Osei was on his feet before Miller's arm had lifted. "That," Osei said, his voice steady and controlled and carrying, "was an act of intimidation directed at a detained civilian during a federal inspection. I am witnessing it. I am noting the time. 1:17 a.m. I will repeat this statement to any person who asks me, in any setting where it becomes relevant." Miller pointed at him. "One more word." "I am not interfering with your inspection," Osei said. "I am exercising my right as a witness to state clearly what I have observed. You may charge me or you may not. But what I just saw will be in my witness statement." He sat back down. His hands were on his knees. They were not shaking. Miller looked at him. The pointing hand came down. Miller looked at the camera. He looked at Reese, who was writing. He looked at Teal, who was at the door. Teal shook his head. "Almost." Miller turned back to Reyna. "You're being detained on suspicion of obstruction of a federal inspection," he said, and the words came out flat and settled, the voice of a man who has made his final calculation. "Under 19 U.S.C. Section 1581, you'll be held pending formal review." He reached to his belt. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the other way." The handcuffs came out. They caught the fluorescent light. Reyna looked at them. She looked at Miller. She looked at the camera in the corner, at the particular angle she had identified in the first 90 seconds of being in this room, and she held the look for exactly 2 full seconds, the same way she had looked at it at 12:11, when the bottle went off the table, so that what she was about to say would be understood, when anyone reviewed this footage, to be a deliberate and informed act, not a last resort. Then she said, "Before you proceed, I need you to look at the bag, the front exterior pocket, the one with the federal seal on the zipper pull." Miller's hand paused. "The orange seal," she said, "on the zipper of the exterior pocket, the one no one touched during the search." He looked at the bag on the table. He looked at the zipper pull on the exterior pocket. The orange seal was there, a strip of tamper-evident plastic, narrow, with a raised federal embossment pressed into the surface, the kind of seal used on evidence containers and classified materials, the kind that cannot be reproduced without access to federal manufacturing supply chains, the kind that, once you see it, is unmistakable. Nobody in the room spoke. "Open it," Hale said quietly. "I'll open it," Reyna said. The next 60 seconds changed everything that happened in that room. If you think you know what's in that pocket, you don't. Stay right here. Part 2 begins the moment she breaks that seal. She reached for the bag with both hands. She found the exterior zipper by touch. She found the orange seal and held it between her fingers for 2 seconds. 2 deliberate, visible, recorded seconds. And then she broke it clean and opened the pocket. Inside was an envelope, standard size, white, the kind that reveals nothing about its origin from the outside. But it carried on its front face a rectangular seal, blue and gold, embossed, with the eagle and the formal header of the United States Department of Justice, pressed into the paper by a mechanical stamp in a federal mailroom. Not a copy, not a printed replica. The physical seal itself, the kind that cannot be approximated. Miller's hands had not moved. The cuffs were still in his grip. Reyna opened the envelope along the top seam. She removed 3 folded pages. She unfolded them. She looked at the first page for 2 seconds. Then she began to read aloud, in the same voice she had used throughout the entire session. Same pace, same register, same complete absence of performance. Task Force Authorization Letter. Joint Operation Designation, Harbor Light. Case Reference, HL20230047. Operating Authority, United States District Court for the Southern District. Authorizing Judge, Senior District Judge Patricia Wren. She turned to the second page. Operative Assignment, Listed operative, Raina A. Okafor. She paused for exactly 1 beat. Effective date of authorization: 14 months and 6 days prior to tonight's date. The fluorescent tube buzzed. Hale's pen had stopped moving. Caldwell had turned from the wall. Teal's phone was in his hand, but he was not looking at it. Miller was looking at the envelope on the table, at the federal seal, at the pages in her hands. He was calculating the math that every person in the room was suddenly calculating: 14 months. And arriving at the same answer they were all arriving at, the one that explained every careful note, every precise objection, every documented request, every second of stillness under his hand. He was looking at it, and he was understanding. Then both doors opened. The corridor door opened first. A woman in a dark suit came through it. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who has entered rooms like this many times and was never the one sitting in the plastic chair. Her identification was on her belt. The 3 letters on it were FBI. She looked at Marcus Teal first. Not at Miller, not at Raina, not at the envelope on the table. She looked at Teal. "Loading Bay 7, she said. Her voice was level. "Is the truck still there?" Teal said nothing. The second door, the primary door, opened 30 seconds later. A second woman in federal credentials crossed the threshold and was already speaking before she had fully cleared the frame. Homeland Security Investigations. She carried a sealed document in a court-stamped envelope, and her voice carried with the efficiency of someone stating facts in a time-compressed situation. "The truck is still there. Bay 7 has been isolated since 1:43 a.m. The manifest for the cargo does not exist in any CBP system we have access to." She held up the sealed document. "Search warrant signed by Judge Patricia Wren covering this inspection area, the adjacent cargo processing zone, loading Bay 7 through Bay 9, and the port's internal records management system. All documentation generated during this session is under federal evidence hold." She looked at Hale. "Including your clipboard." The room was very quiet. Dale Miller was still holding the handcuffs. His hand had not moved since Raina began reading. He was looking at the woman who had read her own task force authorization letter from memory, calmly, in the same voice she had used to request documentation, the same voice she had used to identify the timestamp discrepancy, the same voice she had used for 2 hours in this room. And he was understanding, in the particular slow and vertiginous way of a man watching a foundation crack beneath him, that he had spent 14 months building a machine in this room. And the woman in the plastic chair had spent the same 14 months building a case against it. Harold Ossie looked at Raina. She was folding the pages back along their original creases. Neatly, precisely. She folded the 3rd page, then the 2nd, then the 1st, and returned them to the envelope. She placed the envelope on the table in front of her. Yolanda Reese was writing. Her pen moved without stopping. It would not stop until she had documented everything she had seen in this room on this night. In the notebook she had started on her 2nd week on the job, because she had understood, even then, that the official record and the true record were not always the same thing. Outside, through the frosted glass, the white cargo truck sat motionless in loading Bay 7. Its lights had been off for 93 minutes. It was going nowhere. 14 months. 400 pages. 23 passengers who came through this room and left without an explanation. Tonight, the 24th one had. And the 34th container in a bay that had no manifest was about to explain why the lights had gone out before the truck stopped. End of Part 1. Expansion passages to be woven into main text. Expansion. A. After the primary inspection, before secondary room, insert after stepped left. The secondary inspection area was accessed through a doorway at the far end of the primary hall, marked with a small placard that read, "Secondary Review." Authorized personnel and designated passengers in the particular bureaucratic font that federal agencies use when they want signage to communicate authority without drawing attention. The hallway leading to it was painted the specific institutional beige that exists in hospitals and federal buildings, because it is cheap and because no one ever chose it. It simply remained after everything else was removed. Fluorescent strips ran along the ceiling every 8 feet. 2 of the 3 in this hallway were working at full brightness. 1 was flickering at irregular intervals, fast enough to create a subtle strobing effect that fell below the threshold of anything a person could officially complain about, but well above the threshold at which the nervous system notices. The escort officer, a junior uniformed officer named Collins, who had been doing secondary escorts for 7 months, and who had the quality of someone who had learned to keep his face professionally neutral at all times, said nothing during the walk. He stopped at the secondary inspection room's door, opened it, gestured inside, and returned to the primary hall. Reyna stepped through. She had been in rooms like this before, not this specific building, not this specific room, but this category of room, the government holding room, the controlled space designed to communicate that the person inside it is no longer on the free side of the threshold. She knew what they were built to do, and she knew the particular effects they were built to produce, and she approached those effects the same way she approached any environmental hazard: identify, assess, neutralize where possible, account for where not. The buzzing light, the absence of natural reference points, the chairs designed for extended discomfort, the camera positioned to cover the door rather than the table. The notice on the wall, the one real piece of information in the room, the one thing that told her where the gaps in their coverage were. She sat down. She read the notice. She noted the camera angle. She waited. Expansion B. After Teal delivers tip report, before Reyna exposes timestamp, insert after Teal gives Miller the sheet, Teal lingered near the door after the handoff. He had the practiced spatial awareness of someone who prefers corners and walls over open center positions, not because of physical caution, but because corners give you more visual information and fewer angles of approach. He was watching Reyna read the tip report with the specific intensity of a person who has invested something in the outcome of a reading. Miller came back to the table and stood. He folded his arms. He allowed a slight smile to enter the lower half of his face. Not warmth, but the particular satisfaction of a man placing a card he believes is winning. "Somebody called it in," he said. "Anonymous. Public duty line. Flagged irregular travel patterns and suspicious documentation." Reyna was still reading. She did not look up. "We take those calls seriously," Miller continued. "Every one, whatever the source." He waited. "You understand how this works?" She set the form down. She smoothed it. She looked at the timestamp. Then she looked at the wall clock. Then she went back to the timestamp. It was at that moment, watching her eyes move from the form to the clock and back, calm and unhurried, like a person quietly doing arithmetic, that Teal's expression underwent its first visible change of the evening. Not alarm, something more subtle, the recalibration of a person realizing that the terrain has a feature they hadn't mapped. He checked his phone. The phone showed no new messages. He looked at the frosted glass. He looked at Miller. Miller hadn't seen it yet. He was still waiting for the reaction to the tip report, the flicker of alarm, or the attempt to explain, or the angry protest. He was waiting for the response that everyone gave, the response that confirmed the dynamic. He was still waiting when Reyna said, "This tip was received at 10:47 p.m. Expansion C. Extended Miller-Osei confrontation. Insert before physical confrontation sequence. At 12:38 a.m., Miller told Harold Osei to move. He did it without preamble. He walked to where Osei was sitting, stood over him, and said, "You're moving to the observation chairs at the back. This is an active inspection, and you're in the inspection area." The observation chairs were in the far rear corner, beyond the secondary table, separated from the primary inspection area by a painted line on the floor and a waist-high portable barrier that had been there since some previous reconfiguration of the room and never removed. Moving Osei there would put 12 feet and a barrier between him and Reyna's table. Osei looked at the painted line. He looked at the barrier. He looked at Miller. "The posted protocols for this room do not designate observation chairs," he said. "There is no such designation on the room diagram posted beside the door. It's a standard operational arrangement. Then it should be in the posted protocols. It isn't. Osei folded his blazer more precisely across his knee. I have been cooperative throughout this process. I have answered every question asked of me. I have moved when asked to move to accommodate the inspection. I am not going to move to a location that removes me from the ability to observe what is happening at the primary inspection table, because what is happening at the primary inspection table is something I may be asked to testify about, and my testimony will be more accurate if I can see it clearly. Miller's face went flat. I'm not asking, Miller said. I understand that. I'm explaining my decision. Osei looked at him steadily. If you remove me by force, that will be added to the list of things I witnessed. There was a very long pause. Then Miller pointed at him, the second time tonight the same gesture, and said quietly, You keep talking about testifying. You keep saying that word. You should think very carefully about what it means to make an enemy of this process. Osei looked at the pointing hand. He looked at Miller's face. I have thought carefully, he said. I've had 138 minutes in this room to think carefully. That is what I arrived at. Miller held the point for another 2 seconds. Then he lowered his arm and walked away from Osei and back to the secondary table without speaking again. Caldwell had been watching from the far door. She was watching Osei now, too, with a more careful version of the warmth she had been using all evening, the version that appears when the warmth is being tested by something it hadn't anticipated. Reese had written, 12:38 a.m. Miller attempts to relocate Osei. Osei declines, cites observation purpose. MM backs down. She underlined MM. Expansion D. Expanded physical confrontation and Reese moment, after the table slam. The seconds after Miller brought the form down on the table had a particular quality of aftermath, the silence that follows a very loud sound, which is its own kind of loud. Raina had not moved. Her hands were still folded on the table, both palms resting on the surface, fingers loose. The form was beside her hand. The residual vibration in the table's bolted surface was visible for 2 seconds, and then gone. She looked at Hale. The time is 1:17 a.m. I want it on the record that Officer Miller used physical force against the table surface in proximity to my person during a formal federal inspection session. I want that entered into the official log. Hale wrote. Miller was breathing through his nose. Short, controlled breaths. He had done the thing he had done, and he was managing its aftermath. He looked at the form. He looked at Raina. He looked at the camera. Caldwell moved from the far wall. She put her hand on Miller's arm, very briefly, the way you touch someone in a public setting to signal without speaking. Miller looked at her hand. He looked at her face. She gave him a small nod. Let me handle this part. He stepped back. Caldwell sat down in the chair across from Raina. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Raina with the expression of someone absorbing an unfortunate situation and preparing to reason through it. I understand this hasn't been a comfortable evening, she said. Her voice had recovered all of its warmth. Raina looked at her. We're trying to complete this in a way that works for everyone. But I need you to understand. Caldwell leaned forward slightly. This doesn't go away because you've documented it. The filing process, the complaint process, these take time. They take a lot of time. And in the meantime, the situation here is what it is. She paused. I think the simplest resolution is to sign the adjusted form, allow us to close the file, and go home tonight. The form is inaccurate. It's close enough for... It is factually inaccurate in a way that, if I signed it, would constitute a false federal declaration. I've explained this 3 times. Raina's voice had not changed. I'm not going to give you a different answer because it's 1:17 in the morning, and I've been here for almost 2 hours. Caldwell's smile held for another 2 seconds. Then she stood up. She picked up the form. She looked at it once. She placed it on the secondary table, walked to the far door, and went through it without looking back. Osei watched her go. He turned back to Raina, In that room, at that hour, with everything that had happened since 11:23, he felt the particular weight of what he had said to her when she first arrived. They do this every week, and understood that this was the first time he had watched someone sit in the chair for the entire duration without conceding a single inch of ground. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Reese was writing. Her pen moved in her even, careful hand. And outside, through the frosted glass, the shadow of the cargo truck was still there. Expansion E. After HSI and FBI arrive, expanded aftermath of reveal. The woman from the FBI stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way someone looks at a room whose dimensions they have been given in advance and are now verifying. Her name was Maya Vance, and she had been working this port for 14 months on a parallel track, separately from Reyna's task force, separately from HSY's investigation, building a case from a different direction that had been converging toward this exact room, this exact night, for 6 weeks. She had known about Reyna. She had not known Reyna would be here tonight. Neither had anyone else, including the people who had thought they were running this room. That was the thing about Harbor Light that made it effective. Its two parallel threads had never crossed until now. Teal had been watching for interference from one direction. He had not thought to look for it from two. Vance looked at Miller. "Dale Miller," she said. "Badge number C70441. CBP officer senior grade, assigned to this terminal for 11 years. She said it from memory, not from a document. "You are the subject of an active federal investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, in connection with a documented pattern of abuse of secondary inspection authority. You are also a person of interest in a joint HSY investigation into cargo irregularities at this terminal, specifically loading bays 4 through 9 under 18 U.S.C. Section 1951. She paused. "You don't have to say anything. I'd recommend you don't." Cora Whitfield, HSI, was already on her radio, the sealed warrant in her other hand. She was coordinating with the team at Bay 7, getting confirmation of positions, ensuring the chain of custody on the truck's contents was established before anyone touched anything. She worked with the clipped efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this sequence and is now executing it under real conditions. 34 containers, she said, to Vance, not to the room in general. "No manifest in any CBP system. We have visual confirmation of the vehicle and driver. Bay perimeter is secure." Vance nodded. Miller had not moved. He was standing in the same position, the handcuffs still in his hand, looking at the envelope on the table in front of Reyna. The envelope with the DOJ seal. The case reference that had been active for 14 months, the operative's name typed in capital letters, Reyna A. Okafor. He had been in this room for 11 years. He had managed hundreds of people in this room. He had built the camera angle and the buzzing light and the ambient discomfort and the paperwork traps and the implied threat of institutional weight behind every action he took. He had built a machine, and the machine had spent tonight documenting itself. Every objection that Hale had written down, every timestamp that Reese had noted, every request for documentation that Miller had refused, every moment the tip report had sat on the table with its 10:47 p.m. timestamp, 34 minutes before a plane that hadn't landed yet. All of it on the record. All of it in a case file that had been running for 14 months and that had just received, tonight, its final and most complete chapter. Preston Hale sat down. He sat down in the chair closest to him without looking for it, without checking whether it was the right one, the way people sit when they are no longer managing themselves. Caldwell had come back through the far door when she heard voices. She stopped in the doorframe when she saw Vance and Whitfield. She looked at the federal credentials. She looked at the sealed warrant. She looked at Miller. She looked at the envelope on the table. She understood. She took out her phone and called her union representative. Teal had moved to the wall farthest from both doors. He was not trying to leave. There was nowhere to go, and he understood that. But he was putting space between himself and the center of the room with the instinct of a person who has always preferred perimeter positions. His phone was in his pocket now. He would not be using it for the remainder of the evening. Harold Osei stood up from his chair for the last time. He stood up slowly, the way you stand up after 2.5 hours in a hard plastic chair when you are 58 years old and have been traveling for 20 hours. He straightened his blazer. He picked up the travel pillow that had been sitting on the chair beside him. He put the business card back in his breast pocket. He looked at Raina. She was still at the table. She had recapped the pen she always carried, the one that had been in the outside pocket of her bag all evening, and placed it flat on the tabletop. She was looking at the room with the same expression she had worn when she first walked in. Present, assessed, settled. Osei did not say anything. He did not need to, but he nodded at her, once, slowly, with the weight of a man who has seen something that he will carry in his account of this evening for the rest of his life. And she returned the nod the same way. Yolanda Reese was still writing. She would write for another 11 minutes before she stopped. She would fill 6 pages. On the last page, she would begin the entry that would become, in 4 months, the foundation of the Internal Affairs Supplemental Report, Exhibit R, as it would come to be known, that corroborated everything the body cam and the timestamps and the tip report's metadata had already established. She had begun it on her second week of work because she had understood even then that the official log and the true record were not always the same thing. Tonight, they were. Outside, through the frosted glass, through the wall, through the corridor and the access door and the 60 feet of port facility floor that separated the secondary inspection room from loading bay 7, the white cargo truck sat in its circle of federal light and went nowhere. 14 months, 400 pages, 23 passengers who came through this room and left without an explanation, without an apology, without a name on a complaint form that anyone followed up on. Tonight, the 24th one had, and everything else, the hearing, the suspension, the investigation, the 34 containers and what they contained, the email chains with the redacted recipients, the camera footage with its careful dead zone, the tip report submitted by a terminal whose login credentials belonged to Marcus Teal. All of it was about to begin the slow, grinding, procedurally imperfect, institutionally resistant, partially successful march toward something that looked, from certain angles, in certain lights, in the right moments, like accountability. It would take time. It would take longer than it should. Not everyone would face consequences, and not every consequence would fit the act. But the record was made. The record was real. And the record was already in more hands than the people who had tried to manage this room would ever be able to count. The secondary inspection room became a federal crime scene in the span of about 4 minutes. It happened without drama. There was no shouting, no drawn weapons, no cinematic confrontation between the people who had been running the room all night and the people who had just walked into it. What happened instead was quieter and, in its quietness, more final. Cora Whitfield set the sealed search warrant on the secondary table. She placed it flat, smoothed it with her palm, and looked at Preston Hale. Every form, every log entry, every physical document generated during this session. You are going to separate them, inventory them by item, and hand them to me directly. Nothing leaves this room through a door I didn't come through. She produced an evidence log from her jacket and laid it beside the warrant. Start with the clipboard. Hale looked at the clipboard. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the case number embossed on the warrant's seal, HL2023047, and he looked at Raina's task force letter on the table, which carried the same number in the same format. And he had the specific understanding of a man whose professional life has just rearranged itself around a new and irrevocable fact. He handed over the clipboard without speaking. Whitfield logged it. Date, time, item description, chain of custody notation. She worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who has established evidence chains in adverse conditions and understands that the accuracy of the chain is everything, that a case which survives every other challenge can be destroyed by a gap in documentation. She did not rush. She did not speak unnecessarily. She built the record the way you build the only thing between your case and a defense attorney, with patience and absolute precision. Maya Vance was at the secondary door. She had positioned herself there because the secondary door was the one that led deeper into the port facility, toward the cargo processing zones, toward loading bay 7. She was monitoring the radio traffic from the perimeter team, 2 HSI agents and a federal marshal who had been stationed outside the bay for 19 minutes, waiting for the signal to move. She was waiting on the forensics lead to confirm that the bay's external camera coverage had been captured and locked before anyone touched the truck or its contents. She watched the corridor through the door's narrow window. Nothing moved. The shadow of the truck was still there through the frosted glass at the end of the hall. She keyed her radio. "Forensics confirmed?" The voice that came back was precise. "Confirmed. Camera logs locked at 14 timestamps, verified against master system clock. We're ready. Proceed." 3 seconds of silence. Then, moving. In the secondary inspection room, Marcus Teal heard the radio traffic. He was still against the far wall. His phone had been in his pocket since Whitfield named the search warrant's scope, and his hand had not gone near it since. He was a man who had spent years operating in the margin between visible and invisible, exploiting the fact that his position as a security coordinator gave him access to both federal systems and private ones without quite belonging to either. He understood margins the way engineers understand tolerances, how much space there was, how much pressure a structure could take before it failed. He understood now that the margin was gone. He looked at Miller. Miller had not moved since Raina finished reading the authorization letter. The handcuffs were still in his right hand. His left hand was at his side, very still, and the stillness was not the stillness of a man in control of a situation. It was the stillness of a man who has stopped managing his expression because managing it suddenly requires more energy than he has available. Vance turned from the door and looked at him. "Officer Miller?" she said, and her voice was the voice of the federal government on a specific Tuesday morning at 2:13 a.m., which is not a voice you can argue with. "I need you to place those on the table." Miller looked at the cuffs in his hand. He set them on the secondary table. They made a flat metallic sound against the surface. "Thank you. You're being placed on administrative leave pending federal and internal investigation. You're not under arrest at this moment. You have the right to counsel before speaking with investigators. I'd recommend you exercise that right immediately." He said nothing. Caldwell had her phone to her ear. Her union representative had answered on the second ring. She was speaking in a low, controlled voice, giving the facts in a compressed sequence. Secondary inspection, federal warrant, search in progress, 2 federal agencies present. And the voice on the other end was asking questions that she answered with the compressed answers of someone trying to be accurate and not give anything extra. Diane Caldwell had built her career on institutional loyalty and the belief that the institution she was loyal to was fundamentally sound, even when it made poor decisions, even when the decisions made her uncomfortable. She had never sat with the discomfort long enough to follow it to its source. Tonight, for the first time, she was sitting with it, and the source was a clipboard on an evidence table that contained 2.5 hours of session logs documenting every action taken in this room. She kept her voice level. She kept her face professional. She did not look at Raina. Harold Osei received his passport back at 2:27 a.m. It was returned by Yolanda Reese, who had collected it from the evidence tray under Whitfield's supervision and carried it across the room with both hands, the way you carry something that belongs to someone and that you are aware has been held for a long time without justification. She placed it on the chair beside him, on top of the travel pillow that he had long since stopped turning between his fingers. "Mr. Osei," she said, "I'm sorry for the length of your detention." He looked at the passport. He looked at her. The apology was not scripted. She had not been asked to make it. It had not been approved through channels. It carried no institutional backing and would not appear in any official document. It was simply what Yolanda Reese thought should be said by someone in a position to say it, in a room where the official process had failed a man for 2 hours and 43 minutes without a single explanation. He picked up the passport. He put it in his breast pocket, next to the colleague's business card. "Thank you," he said. He said it to her, not to the room. Then he looked at Reyna. She was standing near the primary table, not at it. She was watching the evidence inventory process with the quiet, functional attention of an operative at the end of a phase of work, monitoring the handoff to ensure nothing is dropped. She met Osei's eyes. He nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of someone acknowledging something that does not require words. She returned it the same way. Then he picked up his blazer and his travel pillow and his carry-on bag, which had been returned to him 20 minutes earlier after a brief and professionally conducted inventory by Reese, and he walked toward the primary door. A federal marshal opened it for him. The corridor beyond was lit and quiet. He walked through it without looking back. He would make his statement to HSI investigators at 9 the following morning, after 6 hours of sleep in a hotel near the airport that he booked from the taxi, paying for it on the card he'd been carrying in his wallet for 2.5 hours in a plastic chair. His statement was precise, organized, and detailed. It ran to 11 pages. He had the memory and the professional habits of a man who has spent 30 years constructing arguments from evidence, and the statement he gave read less like a victim's account and more like a documentary record. He included, at the end, a list of 3 names, colleagues, former students, professionals he knew, who had described similar experiences in this building in the past 14 months. It was the beginning of a list that would eventually contain 23 names. But that night, standing in the corridor outside the secondary inspection room with his passport back in his pocket, Harold Osei knew only that he was going to sleep and then wake up and tell the truth as carefully as he had always told it, and that this time someone would write it down in a place where it could not be quietly mislaid. Loading Bay 7 took 49 minutes to document. The white cargo truck contained 34 containers. Of the 34, 22 were on a manifest that existed in a private logistics company's internal records, but not in any CBP system accessible through standard port channels. 12 had no documentation anywhere in any system that the HSI forensics team could locate in the initial sweep. What the containers held was established over the course of the next 3 weeks and was not publicly disclosed in the preliminary reports. The full contents entered the federal evidence record under seal, where they would remain during the investigation period. What was publicly stated in the HSY press release issued 47 days after the initial warrant's execution was that the cargo represented a significant seizure consistent with a pattern of unauthorized importation activity, and that the investigation was ongoing. The official language was careful and said very little. The people who had been watching the port for 14 months understood what it meant. So did the defense attorneys who started making calls the following morning. Marcus Teal was separated from the secondary inspection room at 2:41 a.m. and escorted to a holding area in the federal section of the terminal by 2 HSI agents. He was informed of his rights. He asked for an attorney. He did not speak again until the attorney arrived, which was at 7:58 the following morning. A defense lawyer named Gerardo Pena, who specialized in federal criminal cases and who had received calls from clients in this building before. The fact that Teal had an attorney with that specific specialty on speed dial at 2:41 in the morning was itself documented. Reyna Okafor filed her preliminary after-action report at 6:15 a.m., sitting at a terminal in the HS Wine field office, 12 blocks from the airport. She had been there since 3:40, transported in a federal vehicle after the secondary inspection room was fully processed, and her debrief with Vance and Whitfield was complete. The debrief had taken 53 minutes. For the first 40 of those minutes, Vance and Whitfield had asked questions, and she had answered them. Her answers were detailed, organized, and referenced specific timestamps throughout. She had been holding the timeline in her head since 11:23 the previous evening, recording it in the same mental format she would have used in any operational environment. Event, time, actor, observable detail. And the debrief was simply the process of transferring that format onto paper. For the final 13 minutes, after the formal questioning was complete, she and Vance sat in a small room and did not speak for a while. It was Vance who broke the silence. The tip report. You flagged the timestamp in the room. 34 minutes before the aircraft landed, Reyna said. We tracked the terminal ID at 10:41 last night. M.Teal-07. Private laptop, port facility employee network, using a credential that should have been deactivated when Teal was transitioned from his previous role 8 months ago. Vance looked at the table. Someone forgot to update the access registry, or chose not to. That's the kind of thing that needs to be in the record. It will be. Vance paused. The form, the supplemental declaration, Section 7B. Reyna looked at her. They've done it before. Hale prepares a form with a modified purpose declaration. The passenger signs it. Most people sign because they want to go home, and the altered purpose creates a discrepancy with the original entry form that CBP can use later if they need additional leverage. It's procedural insurance. Vance folded her hands. We have 11 prior instances in the last 14 months. 3 of them resulted in the passengers facing follow-up inquiries based on the discrepancy. She looked at Reyna steadily. They were relying on you not to read it carefully. I read it carefully, Reyna said. Vance almost smiled. It did not quite reach completion. We noticed. Outside the window of the field office, the city was beginning to lighten. The particular gray of a city just before dawn. Not dark anymore, not light yet. The sky, that color that exists in the interval when the night shift is still working and the day shift doesn't know yet what happened. A delivery truck moved along the street below. A light came on in a building across the way. Reyna looked out the window and said, The 10 minutes. Vance was quiet. The body cam gap. Midnight 31 to 12:41. I noticed the camera wasn't positioned to cover the primary table during the search. The footage of Miller's physical contact wouldn't be on that camera from the right angle, but whatever happened in the corridor outside during those 10 minutes is missing, Vance said. IT logged it as a technical malfunction. We pulled the system error logs. She paused. No error recorded. The absence of a recorded error in a system that records all errors automatically was its own kind of evidence. It pointed at something, someone with access to the recording infrastructure who had not made an error but had made a choice, and who had been careful enough to cover the choice on the surface, but not careful enough to cover the layer underneath. Reyna filed it. She did not yet know what it connected to. She knew it connected to something. She turned back to the terminal and continued writing her report. You've been with this story since the beginning. What happens next? The hearings, the evidence, what was actually in that truck, is what everything in that room was protecting. Stay close. The article ran 6 weeks later. It appeared under Delia Morrow's byline in a regional investigative publication with a national readership. The headline was factual rather than inflammatory, which is the kind of headline that carries the most weight in the long run. 23 detentions, 0 charges, a documented pattern inside secondary inspection. The article was precise. It traced 23 instances of extended secondary inspection over 14 months, all logged under the badge number of a single officer. It cited the average detention time, 97 minutes, against the CBP Directive 3340-049A standard of 22 minutes. It named no one by their full name in the published version, in compliance with her publication's legal review process, though the badge number was public record and the connection was not difficult to trace. It quoted the CBP passenger rights notice posted in the secondary inspection room, specifically the 4th bullet point, verbatim. It did not name its source. The article's final line said only that the internal records had been provided by an individual within the port facility who had requested anonymity. Morrow had received the tip 32 days after the night of the warrant. It had arrived as an encrypted file sent to her secure inbox, the one she'd set up 2 years ago specifically for port and logistics sources. The file contained a complete copy of the session log database covering the relevant 14-month period, with the 23 instances highlighted in yellow. The metadata showed the file had been assembled from within the port's internal network. The terminal ID attached to the metadata was not M.Teale-07. It was not any terminal ID that appeared in any existing employee record. That detail, a terminal ID that should not have existed sending a file that documented something that should not have happened, sat in Morrow's notes in a folder labeled Pending Source Verification. She had been trying to identify it for a month. She had not published it because she could not verify it. She would continue not publishing it for some time, because the thing about a source you cannot identify is that you cannot know if they are a whistleblower or a management of information or something else entirely. She filed it and kept looking. 3 days after Morrow's article ran, the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility announced that it had opened an inquiry into secondary inspection procedures at the terminal. The announcement was 3 sentences long. It used the phrase, "taking these concerns seriously" once, and the phrase, "appropriate review process" twice. The announcement did not name Dale Miller. It did not reference the federal investigation. It described the matter as under internal review in coordination with relevant federal partners. The relevant federal partners did not comment. The day after the CBP announcement, Port Director Sloan DeVere submitted a letter to his direct superior informing her of his intention to retire, effective in 60 days, citing personal health reasons. The letter was accepted. His retirement was processed without a review of his conduct during the events of the night in question. His pension was approved at its full rate. His office issued a 2-sentence statement wishing the port well in its future operations. DeVere did not speak to any investigator voluntarily. He retained an attorney the same week he submitted his retirement letter. His attorney was a former federal prosecutor with significant experience in public official matters, which is a very specific kind of career trajectory that tells you something precise about the kind of cases someone expects to face. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice sent 2 investigators to the terminal in the 7th week after the warrant's execution. They were quiet, professionally dressed, and conducted their initial site visit on a Wednesday morning when the terminal was running its normal operation, so that the visit looked like any other inspection. They spent 4 hours in the facility, speaking with current employees in small groups, reviewing physical layouts, examining documentation procedures. One of the investigators was a woman named Patricia Solis, who had been with the Civil Rights Division for 11 years and who had led 3 prior pattern or practice investigations into port facilities. She had the quality of someone who has read many documents and knows which ones to look for. On the afternoon of her visit, she found, in the facility's maintenance records, a request submitted 18 months earlier to reposition the secondary inspection room's camera. The request cited sightline obstruction. It had been approved in 48 hours. She photographed the request. She photographed the camera in its current position. She photographed the room from 3 angles that established, beyond reasonable interpretive doubt, that the current camera angle did not cover the center of the room where the inspection table was located. She did not interview anyone on that visit. She returned to Washington with the photographs and added them to a file that was already 400 pages and growing. The opening of a pattern or practice investigation by the Civil Rights Division requires a written finding that there is reasonable cause to believe that a law enforcement agency has engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives persons of rights under the Constitution or federal law, pursuant to 42 U.S.C. Section 14,141. The finding must be approved by the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights before it is officially opened. The approval came in week 9. The letter was sent to the terminal's administrative leadership, to CBP's national headquarters, and to the Port Authority's governing board. It stated the opening of an investigation, the scope of that investigation, and the requirement for full cooperation. It was 3 pages long. The final paragraph noted that the investigation would likely require 12 to 18 months to complete, and that preliminary findings would be issued at the 6-month mark. 12 to 18 months. 6-month preliminary findings. The language of federal process which moves at the speed of institutional systems that have built into themselves, by design or by accretion, every possible mechanism for slowing down. Raina read the letter when it was forwarded to her by Whitfield. She read it in full, folded it, and returned it to the envelope. She had learned, a long time before this night, that the timeline of justice and the timeline of urgency did not operate on the same scale, and that the only sustainable way to work across that gap was patience. The specific, active, documented kind, the kind that does not require feeling good about the pace in order to continue the work. She continued the work. The CBP Internal Affairs disciplinary hearing for Dale Miller was scheduled for week 14. It was a formal proceeding under CBP's Office of Internal Affairs, conducted before a 3-person panel consisting of 2 senior CBP officials from a different district and 1 independent reviewer appointed by the Commissioner's Office. The panel had reviewed the physical evidence package, which by this point included the session logs from the night in question, Yolanda Reese's handwritten notes, entered as Exhibit R, the tip report with its verified terminal ID, the body cam footage for the portions that were recoverable, the inventory form signed by Reese, and the supplemental declaration form with its documented inaccuracies. The package also included 22 prior session logs from the 14-month period, cross-referenced with passenger flight records confirming that the detention times recorded bore no correlation to the complexity or duration of the flights in question, and that the demographic profile of the detained passengers was not consistent with random selection. A statistical analysis prepared by an independent consultant hired by the IA office concluded that the probability of the observed demographic pattern arising by chance, given the terminal's overall passenger demographic, was less than 1 in 700. The hearing itself took 2 days. On the first day, the panel reviewed the documentary evidence. The session log was read into the record by the IA officer assigned to the case, read aloud, in full, including the timestamps, including Miller's statement at 12:08 a.m. that had been entered by Hale at Reyna's request. When the IA officer read that particular entry, Officer Miller, badge C70441, stated, "It is if I say it is, time 12:08 a.m. The room was quiet for 2:08 a.m. The room was quiet for 2 full seconds. On the second day, witnesses were called. Yolanda Reese testified for 47 minutes. She had her notebook. She had been informed by her own attorney, retained the week before the hearing, that she had a right to have counsel present during testimony. She arrived with the notebook and with the attorney, and with the particular composure of someone who has been carrying a weight for 14 weeks, and has decided that today is the day she sets it down properly. She read from the notebook directly where the record required contemporaneous documentation. She described, in sequence, every event she had personally witnessed from her position in the corner of the room. She described the timestamp at which she began taking notes. She described her decision to stand when Miller grabbed Reyna's arm, and her decision to write in her notebook slowly enough for the action to be visible. She described the look Miller had given her when he saw her writing. She was asked, by the panel's independent reviewer, whether she had felt any pressure during the events of that night to not document what she was witnessing. She said, plainly, yes. She was asked to describe the nature of that pressure. She described the look. She described Miller's positioning in the room. She described the general operational culture in the Secondary Inspection Division, which she characterized as one where junior officers understood that their advancement depended on not creating friction with senior staff. She was precise about the distinction between what she could document directly and what she understood from context. She was not dramatic. She was not uncertain. She had been in the room. She had written it down. She was reading what she wrote. When she finished, the panel chair thanked her. She returned to her seat with the notebook under her arm. Miller's attorney, a union-retained labor lawyer named Garrett Foley with 20 years of experience representing federal employees in disciplinary proceedings, mounted a competent defense built primarily on the argument that the actions in question represented reasonable exercise of discretionary authority within the context of a complex secondary inspection, and that the federal task force element had not been disclosed to the officers present, making their conduct understandable, if not optimal. He argued that qualified immunity principles, while applicable primarily to civil proceedings, reflected a broader principle of fairness in evaluating officer conduct in ambiguous circumstances. The panel asked him to address the tip report timestamp. He said that the discrepancy, while concerning, could reflect a system error. He was asked about the terminal ID M.TEALE-07. He said his client had no knowledge of how the tip was submitted. He was asked about the supplemental declaration form's pre-populated inaccurate section. He said his client was not the preparer of that form. The form had been prepared by Preston Hale. Hale was not at the disciplinary hearing. Hale was cooperating with the federal investigation under an agreement that his counsel had negotiated over the 6 weeks following the night of the warrant. He had provided the federal investigators with the complete procedural history of the supplemental declaration form practice, when it started, how it was implemented, who directed it, how the altered entries were constructed to appear superficially credible. He had provided the names of the passengers he was aware of who had signed the altered forms in prior instances. He had provided copies of the templates used to generate the pre-populated versions. His cooperation did not purchase immunity. It purchased consideration. The distinction was specific, and his attorney was specific about it in every conversation. Cooperation is a factor, not a guarantee. The list of who got away with what and who didn't is coming, and it doesn't look the way you'd hope. But it's real, which is what matters. Tomas Echeverria filed the civil complaint in federal district court in week 16. The plaintiffs were 7 individuals. Harold Osei was the lead plaintiff. The other 6 were drawn from the list he had provided in his initial statement, individuals who had been detained in the same secondary inspection room by the same officer during the same 14-month period, without charge, without explanation, and without the compensation of anything resembling an apology until the federal investigation made the apology politically unavoidable. The complaint was filed under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging deprivation of constitutional rights under color of federal authority. It named Miller individually, Teal individually, Caldwell individually in her supervisory capacity, and the Port Authority as an institutional defendant. It sought compensatory and punitive damages. The city's legal counsel requested an initial conference within 2 weeks of the filing. At the conference, a preliminary settlement framework was discussed. The numbers were not made public. The terms were not made public. The standard language, no admission of wrongdoing, was present in every version of the draft that circulated between the parties. Osei's position on the settlement was communicated through Echeverria in a single sentence. He would consider any framework that included a specific documented acknowledgement of the pattern, the 23 detentions, the 97-minute average, the statistical finding, as part of the public record, regardless of the personal compensation amount. The city's legal counsel said that specific kind of acknowledgement was outside their settlement authority. Echeverria said he understood. He said his clients would await a revised proposal. He said the trial calendar was running and he was prepared to proceed to discovery. Discovery, in a case like this one, is a specific kind of threat. It means depositions. It means production of internal documents. It means compelled testimony from everyone who was in that room, and everyone who supervised everyone who was in that room, and everyone who received a report from anyone who supervised anyone who was in that room. Discovery is the part where the institution's immune system is tested at full load, and Echeverria had been practicing this kind of law for long enough to know precisely how much that test cost. In money, in time, in the specific corrosive exposure of internal communications that no institution prefers to release. The revised proposal arrived 3 weeks later. It included a 7-figure confidential compensation figure, divided among the 7 plaintiffs in proportions negotiated by Echeverria, based on documented harm and duration of detention. It included the standard NDA and no admission language. It included, in an appendix that had been added after the second round of negotiation, a paragraph acknowledging that CBP's internal data showed an above-average rate of extended detentions in the secondary inspection area during the relevant period, with a commitment to address that rate through enhanced oversight and procedural review. It was not the specific, documented acknowledgement Osei had asked for. Echeverria called him on a Tuesday evening and read the full text of the appendix paragraph over the phone. Osei was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that the best we're going to get before trial?" Echeverria gave him an honest answer, which is the kind of answer that a good attorney gives even when it isn't comfortable. Probably yes, in the short term. A trial would take 2 to 4 more years and would produce either a better outcome or a worse one, and the probability distribution was not uniform. He said what he always said in these conversations. The decision belonged to his client, and whatever his client decided, he would execute professionally and without reservation. Osei said he needed 2 weeks. Marcus Thiel was indicted in week 18. The indictment was on 2 counts: conspiracy to commit extortion under color of official right under 18 U.S.C. section 1951, and falsification of federal records under 18 U.S.C. section 1519 in connection with the tip report submission and the terminal credential misuse. The indictment was the product of a grand jury proceeding that lasted 3 days and that drew on the evidence assembled over the preceding months: the terminal ID, the metadata from the tip report, the email chain with the redacted recipients, the Bay 7 cargo documentation. The email chain was read into the federal record during the indictment proceedings in a form that preserved the information while protecting the ongoing investigation. 3 emails, times and dates specified: 9:11 p.m., 9:48 p.m., and 10:22 p.m., all on the night in question, sent from an account within the CBP internal network, received by accounts that the indictment identified only as Person A, Person B, and Person C. The subject line of all 3 emails was the same: Bay 7, tonight. The bodies of the emails were redacted in the public filing. The redactions covered the names of the recipients. Person C had not been identified. The investigation was continuing. Thiel's defense attorney filed a motion to suppress the terminal ID evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds. The motion was denied in week 22. Thiel's attorney immediately filed a notice of appeal to the circuit court. The appeal would take approximately 8 months. In the meantime, Thiel remained out on bond, his port facility access revoked, his security clearance suspended, pending the outcome of the proceedings. He was a man in his mid-40s who had spent 20 years building a career in the infrastructure between public and private authority, and that infrastructure no longer admitted him. He went to the same coffee shop every morning. He did not speak to reporters. He did not speak publicly at all. His attorney negotiated with the federal prosecutor's office. The word cooperation came up in those negotiations. The prosecutor was specific. Cooperation on identifying Person C would be a significant consideration. Thiel's attorney conveyed the offer. Thiel's response was conveyed back in a single word: no. His attorney conveyed the consequences of that position. Thiel's response, conveyed in writing and entered into the negotiation record, was that he had no information relevant to Person C's identity. The prosecutor noted that statement for the record. Dale Miller was suspended without pay in week 15, pending the outcome of the IA hearing. The suspension came after the panel issued its preliminary findings: a documented pattern of extended detentions without documented cause, use of physical force outside the parameters of authorized detention procedures, failure to document the basis for continued detention as required by 8 CFR, Section 235.3, and supervisory conduct inconsistent with the CBP Code of Professional Conduct. The findings were preliminary. They were not final. Miller's union, the American Federation of Government Employees, which represented CBP officers, and which had negotiated protections that made suspension without pay available only as a preliminary measure pending full adjudication, immediately filed for expedited arbitration. The arbitration process would take between 6 and 9 months. Miller was at home. He was not speaking to investigators. He was not speaking to reporters. He had retained Garrett Foley for the IA proceedings and a separate attorney for the potential civil liability under the Echeverria complaint, and the 2 attorneys had agreed that silence was the correct position on all fronts until the full scope of the case against him was established. He had given 11 years to this building. He had built a machine and run it carefully, and protected it with the particular patience of a man who understands that institutions protect their own as long as you stay useful. He had believed on some level that he had never made explicit even to himself that he was permanent in a way that the people who came through his room were not. He sat at home and read the IA panel's preliminary findings 3 times, and each time he arrived at the same passage. The statistical analysis finding a probability of 1 in 700 that the observed demographic pattern was random. He had never thought of it in terms of probability. He had never thought of it in terms of pattern. He had thought of it in terms of individual determinations, case by case, shift by shift, each one defensible on its own terms if you never stepped back far enough to see the shape they made together. Someone had stepped back. Preston Hale resigned from CBP in week 11 before the IA hearing, while his cooperation agreement was still being negotiated. His resignation was accepted. His cooperation agreement was finalized in week 14. He would testify for the government in the Teal case. He would provide written submissions to the IA proceeding covering the supplemental declaration form practice. In exchange, the government would note his cooperation in any future proceeding related to his own conduct and would not seek to initiate a separate prosecution unless new evidence of additional violations beyond those already documented came to light. He moved to a different city. He did not practice in any federal facility again. Diane Colwell received a formal letter of reprimand from CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility in week 16. The letter cited her supervisory failure to ensure proper documentation of the grounds for extended detention, her failure to investigate the tip report timestamp discrepancy when it was raised in her presence, and the 2021 personnel matter, the prior misconduct complaint against Miller, that had been closed without proper review committee process, under Colwell's signature. The 2021 matter was being reopened. The letter of reprimand was placed in her permanent personnel file. She remained in her supervisory position. Pending the reopened 2021 inquiry and the outcome of the broader IA process, she had been advised by her own union representative to continue performing her duties and to avoid actions that could be characterized as retaliatory toward any individuals involved in the proceedings. She had followed that advice. She was good at her job in the ways that could be measured by the metrics that federal supervisory evaluations used. She was efficient. She processed paperwork accurately. She made decisions within established parameters. She arrived on time. She had learned, or was beginning to learn, that these qualities were not insulation from accountability in the way she had believed them to be. That competent execution of procedure within a corrupt system did not exempt you from the system's corruption. That the warmth she had always used as a professional tool had served, in that room, as cover for actions she had not been willing to see clearly. Whether that learning would produce change was a question the record could not yet answer. Yolanda Reese came in every morning. 3 of her colleagues had stopped eating lunch with her the week after Morrow's article ran. 2 more had stopped in the second week. The Secondary Inspection Division had a particular atmosphere in those months, not hostile in any overt or documentable sense, just colder, quieter, the specific social temperature of an organization that has been exposed and is processing the exposure in the way organizations process it, by tightening the circle and cooling toward anyone perceived as having opened it. Reese had not opened it. She had been in a room, doing her job, and had written down what she saw. She came in every morning. She wrote her reports. She documented everything, still, in the notebook she carried in her left breast pocket, the habit that had started on her second week of work and that she had no intention of stopping. At month 4, a transfer request she had submitted, not to leave CBP, to move to a different division within the same terminal, one she had applied for before the events of that night, was approved. The approval came without comment or ceremony, which was the way these things typically came. She submitted her final day of transfer note to the Secondary Inspection Division log in the same format she had used every day for 8 months, factual, precise, time-stamped. She initialed it. She logged out of the system. She walked out of the Secondary Inspection Division for the last time on a Wednesday morning, and she carried her notebook with her. 3 months after that, Exhibit R, the 16 pages of handwritten notes she had provided to the IA proceeding, was cited in the Civil Rights Division's 6-month preliminary findings as contemporaneous first-hand documentation of particular evidentiary significance. It was the only piece of evidence in the entire package that had been generated in the room by a person whose job was not to document, but who had chosen, on their own initiative, to do so anyway. Before you hear how this ends, you need to know that it doesn't end cleanly. What comes next is real, which means it's partial and slow, and some of it is still unresolved. That's not a flaw in the story. That's what accountability actually looks like when it's happening, as opposed to when it's already finished. Harold Osei signed the settlement agreement in month 6. He signed it on a Tuesday afternoon in Tomas Echeverria's office at a conference table with a window that faced a courtyard with a single tree. The tree was not remarkable. The view was not remarkable. It was simply the view in front of him when he sat down and read the settlement agreement from the beginning, which he did in full, without rushing, the same way he would read a contract he was about to commit to for the first time. The acknowledgement paragraph was still there. It still said, above average rate of extended detentions. It still did not say what he had asked it to say. He had read the paragraph 20 times in 6 months, and it had not changed, and it was not going to change, because the institution's legal counsel understood exactly which words constituted an admission of liability and which constituted something that sounded like responsibility without triggering the legal consequences of responsibility. He had known, when he decided to sign, that this was the outcome. He had decided to sign because Echeverria had told him the truth about the alternatives, and because the truth about the alternatives was that they were longer and less certain and more exhausting. And because Harold Osei was 58 years old and had been fighting variations of this fight for 30 years in different rooms and different buildings and different contexts, and because the money from the settlement, divided among 7 plaintiffs, would do more tangible good in the hands of people who needed it than it would do sitting in escrow while a trial ground forward. He signed it. He initialed each page. He handed it back to Echeverria. Then he sat with it for a moment. The acknowledgement paragraph, he said. The above-average rate language. Yes, Echeverria said. Echeverria. It'll be in the public record. Yes, the settlement agreement is not sealed. Anyone can read it. Osei nodded. He looked at the tree in the courtyard. Then it's something, he said. Echeverria said it was something. He said it carefully, the way a lawyer says something when they mean it, and also want to be precise about its scope. It was something. It was also not everything. Both of those things were true, simultaneously and without contradiction, and living with their simultaneous truth was what working in this field felt like from the inside, always. They shook hands. Osei put on his coat. He walked out through the office lobby into a late afternoon that was cold but dry, the kind of day that requires no particular interpretation. He called his sister from the car. He talked for a long time. The 10 minutes of missing body cam footage from midnight 31 to 12:41 a.m. remained unaccounted for at the 6-month mark of the federal investigation. The IT division had conducted 2 separate audits of the recording system. Both audits confirmed that the system showed no error codes, no malfunction events, and no scheduled maintenance activity during that window. The recording simply did not exist, and the record of whether it had ever been captured and subsequently deleted, or had never been captured at all, had been handled by the same system that showed no error in handling it. At the 6-month mark, the HSY forensics team brought in an external contractor, a digital forensics firm that specialized in federal evidence recovery, to conduct an independent audit of the system. The contractor's preliminary finding noted anomalies in the recording architecture consistent with external access to the system's buffer management function during the relevant window. The finding did not name an individual. It did not establish chain of custody for the access. It established that the access had occurred and that it had been intentional rather than accidental. Intentional. In a port facility where the only people with access to the recording system's buffer management function were the facility's IT staff, plus anyone with a security coordination credential at the administrative level. Marcus Thiel had held a security coordination credential at the administrative level until the night his credential was suspended. His attorney, when asked about this finding, said his client had no comment. The investigation continued. Delia Morrow published her second article in month 5. This one was narrower and more specific than the first. It focused on the Supplemental Declaration Form Practice, the CBP Form 6059B preparation process, and the specific instances in which pre-populated fields had deviated from passengers' original declarations. It cited 11 documented cases, drawing on evidence that had entered the federal record and was therefore publicly accessible, and it walked through the mechanics of how an inaccurate pre-populated form could be used, in subsequent administrative proceedings, to create a discrepancy that served the detaining officer's interests. It was careful, sourced, and entirely accurate. Morrow's anonymous source, the CBP internal terminal that had sent the encrypted file to her secure inbox, had sent a second file in month 4. This one contained the email chain, not the redacted version in the federal record, the unredacted version, with all 3 recipient addresses visible. She had it. She had not published it. Publishing an unredacted version of evidence that was currently under a federal evidence seal would end her as a journalist and potentially expose her to obstruction liability. She knew what she had, and she knew what it meant, and she knew she could not use it in the way it needed to be used until the federal investigation either released the redactions or concluded. She kept the file on an encrypted drive in a location that only she knew about. She kept looking for the source. The terminal ID that had sent both files, the one that didn't correspond to any current employee record, had a creation timestamp that her contact in the facility's IT department, someone she had cultivated over 2 years for exactly this kind of situation, was able to identify for her off the record. The terminal ID had been created 14 months ago. On the same day, the Federal Task Force's operational authorization had been signed by Senior District Judge Patricia Wren. She sat with that for a long time. She did not publish it. She put it in the pending source verification folder and kept looking. Raina Okafor submitted her final operational report in month 3, closing the Harbor Light file as far as her personal role in it was concerned. The investigation itself continued. It would continue for a long time, under the management of the federal agencies whose jurisdiction it was. Her role had been specific and bounded, and she had completed it. The file was theirs now. She took 14 days of leave. She spent 10 of them in a city she liked, that was not the city where the terminal was located. She read, she walked, she slept enough. On the 11th day, she started doing the work of returning to herself, which is always its own kind of work and which always requires exactly as much time as it requires and not less. On the 15th day, she went back to the office. The work was the same work, a different city, a different assignment, the same fundamental structure. Gathering evidence that could not be gathered any other way, from positions that required patience and precision, and the willingness to sit in rooms that were designed to make you feel small, and to not feel small in them. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The particular thing she had that made her good at it was not courage exactly, though that was part of it. It was the ability to hold the long view while operating in the short one, to know, while sitting in a hard plastic chair under a buzzing fluorescent light with a man's hand on her shoulder, that the paper trail was more durable than the hand, that the record would outlast the room, that what she had documented would matter to people who had not yet been born the night she documented it. In month 5, she received a message through the secure operational channel from Maya Vance. It was brief. It said that the Civil Rights Division's preliminary findings had been approved for release at the 6-month mark. It said that the preliminary findings included a specific citation of the tip report timestamp discrepancy as evidence of coordinated premeditation. It said that the port director's early retirement had been formally noted as a person of interest, matter for possible future investigation. Possible future investigation. The language of a system that has more to look at than it has capacity to look at simultaneously. She forwarded the message to Whitfield. She filed it in the operational archive. She went back to work. The email arrived on a Thursday evening in month 7. It came to her encrypted work account, the one that received operational communications. The sender field showed a string of characters that resolved, when she put it through the directory, to an account that did not appear in any organizational database she had access to. Not FBI, not HSI, not DOD, not any interagency communication system she recognized. The subject line was HL-2023-047, supplemental. She sat at her desk for a moment. The office was quiet. Most people had gone home. The light from her monitor was the primary light in her section of the room. She opened the email. There was no body text. There was a single attachment, a PDF file named case_48_supplemental.pdf. She looked at the file name. She did not open the attachment immediately. She ran the standard security verification protocol on the file: hash check, origin trace, executable scan. The file was clean. Its origin trace returned the same unidentifiable account as the email itself. She opened it. She read the first page. She closed the laptop. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory, not from her contact list. From memory, the way you dial a number you have kept in your head because certain numbers are not the kind you write down. The line rang twice. Someone answered. She said, "How long have you known?" The line was quiet. Not disconnected. She could hear the particular quality of an open line, the faint, low-frequency presence that distinguishes a connected call from a dead one. Someone was there, on the other end, in a room she could not picture, in a city she did not know, holding a phone and having decided, in the fraction of a second between her question and their answer, what to say. Then they said it. It was a voice she recognized, a voice she had not expected, a voice that rearranged, in the space of 2 syllables, several things she had believed to be true about the preceding 14 months. We do not hear what the voice said. We hear only that it said something. And we know, from the way Reyna Okafor sat at her desk with her closed laptop in front of her and the phone pressed to her ear, and the particular quality of stillness that comes over a person who is receiving information that they will not fully process until much later, that what the voice said was not simple. The office was quiet around her. The monitor light reflected off the closed laptop surface in a pale rectangle. Somewhere in the building, an elevator opened and closed. She listened. Outside, the city moved through its evening in the way cities do, indifferent to the small rooms inside its buildings where the people who live in its gaps are doing the slow, grinding, necessary work of finding out what is true, and writing it down and carrying it forward into proceedings and hearings and articles and sealed evidence files and settlement appendix paragraphs and notebooks carried in left breast pockets. The truck in Loading Bay 7 had never reached its destination. The second email from the unidentifiable terminal was still in Morrow's encrypted drive. The 10 minutes of missing footage was still missing. The third recipient of the Bay 7 email chain was still redacted, and the voice on the phone was still speaking, and Reyna was still listening, and whatever it was saying, it was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a case file that did not yet have a number. Insert after. The debrief had taken 53 minutes. Vance and Reyna seen. The full version of that exchange, the 13 minutes after the formal questions were complete, had a quality different from the preceding 40. The formal portion had been efficient and documentary. She asked. Reyna answered. The facts were established in the record. The 13 minutes after were something else. They were the portion of the conversation that would not appear in any report. Vance had been watching the port for 16 months, from a different direction. She had built her case through a network of informants and financial analysis, tracing the movement of money through the port's contractor payment systems, identifying anomalies that pointed toward human involvement in the cargo irregularities, without giving her the operational evidence she needed to close. She had known, from her financial analysis, that someone inside CBP was facilitating access. She had not known it was Miller until the tip report's metadata came back to M.TEALE-07, and the cross-reference put Miller in the same operational picture. The financial trail, she said, during those 13 minutes. We have 18 months of it. It goes to 3 accounts. 2 of them are identified. 1 isn't. Reyna looked at her. Person C. Person C. Vance was quiet for a moment. Whatever was in that truck, it wasn't the beginning. We're looking at a continuous operation. 4 years, minimum, based on the financial timeline. That predates Miller's pattern by 2 years. Yes. The implication of that was left in the room without being stated. An operation 4 years old, in a port facility, moving cargo through a controlled entry point. That did not happen without infrastructure. Infrastructure at a port meant access. Access meant credentials. Credentials meant institutional position. Miller was not the architect of a 4-year operation. He was a piece of it, a useful piece, positioned correctly, given the right tools and the right cover. The camera angle, Reyna said. The maintenance request. Filed 18 months ago. Vance met her eyes. But the camera angle existed before the maintenance request. We have footage from 26 months ago that shows the same dead zone. The request just formalized it. 26 months. Someone had known about the dead zone before the request was filed. Someone had been using it. They sat with that for the remainder of the 13 minutes. Then they shook hands, briefly, the handshake of two people who have been working toward the same point from opposite directions and have finally met in the middle, and Reyna went to the terminal to write her report, and Vance went to find the financial analyst she had been working with for 6 months to begin the next phase of the work. Neither of them knew, that morning, that the answer to the question they were both forming would arrive in month 7 in the form of a PDF file with no body text and a name attached to it that neither of them had considered. Insert after. Loading Bay 7 took 49 minutes to document. Expanded Bay 7 scene. The federal marshal who led the processing of Bay 7 was a woman named Deanna Cruz, 16 years in the service, who had processed cargo scenes at ports 3 times before, and who ran this one with the particular methodology of someone who understands that the evidence chain is everything, and that the difference between a conviction and an acquittal, in a case like this, will be traced to whether the chain held at every single link. She worked through the containers systematically, outside to inside, left to right, photographing before opening, inventorying before removing, logging each step with a timestamp. It was slow work. It was meant to be slow. The quality of the documentation mattered more than the speed of the documentation, and Cruz understood this in her bones. By the time the first container's contents were fully documented, it was 3:45 in the morning. The HSY forensics team had arrived by then, 4 people with equipment cases, setting up a processing station in the bay's adjacent holding area. The overnight dock workers who had been held at the facility's security station since the perimeter was established were quiet and cooperative, 2 of them falling asleep in their chairs, one asking repeatedly whether he could call his wife. Someone let him call his wife. The truck's driver, a man who had said nothing since being detained and who had a defense attorney number memorized but not saved in his phone, the same way Teal had Gerardo Pena's number memorized, sat in a separate room and said nothing at all. He was from somewhere else. He had been hired 6 weeks ago through a logistics intermediary that had since dissolved its online presence, leaving behind a shell domain and a dead address. The chain of custody for his hiring was built to disappear under pressure, and it was disappearing. Finding what was underneath the disappearance was the work of months and multiple agency cooperation, and it was happening, incrementally, in the slow, relentless way that federal investigations happen when they have enough material to work with. They had enough material to work with. Insert after Miller was at home section. Expanded description of Miller's situation. He was 52 years old, and he had never, in his professional life, been on the wrong side of an investigation. He had been the investigation, or he had been adjacent to it, or he had been the person who determined how certain things were logged and how certain things were not logged and which direction certain inquiries went when they arrived on his desk. He had understood, clearly and without drama, that the institution worked for people who made themselves useful to it, and he had made himself useful, and the institution had worked for him. What he had not understood, what he understood now, sitting at home reading a preliminary IA finding for the 3rd time, was that the institution had a threshold, that the institution's protection was conditional, that when the exposure reached a certain level, the institution did not protect its own. The institution reorganized around the exposure, absorbed it, assigned it to individuals, and continued. He was the individual it had been assigned to. The IA panel's preliminary findings were 23 pages. He had read them 3 times, and he had given particular attention to the passage on page 9 that read, "The panel notes that the pattern of conduct documented in this finding is not consistent with isolated incidents of poor judgment, but with deliberate and systematic practice extending over an extended period." Deliberate. Systematic. Those were the words that separated administrative discipline from criminal liability, and they were now in a federal document under his name. His attorney had told him carefully that cooperation was still available as an option. He had not responded to that. He had not responded because the decision he was facing was not a simple one and could not be made in the initial weeks. The decision was whether the information he had, about Person C, about the 4-year timeline, about the financial arrangements that predated his own involvement by 2 years and into which he had been recruited rather than having built from scratch, was worth more to the government than his silence was worth to the people it implicated. That calculation had a very specific answer. He knew what the answer was. He sat with it. Insert after Colwell section. Additional scene. In the months after the events of that night, Diane Colwell found herself returning, in unguarded moments, to the session logs. Not the physical documents, those were in federal custody. She was returning to them in the way you return to a conversation in memory, replaying the sequence, looking for the point where she could have done something different that would have resulted in a different outcome. She kept arriving at the same point. The moment Reyna said the tip had been submitted, 34 minutes before the aircraft landed. She had been in the room when that was said. She had heard it, and she had done nothing with it, not because she hadn't understood it, but because understanding an anomaly and acting on it were different things in an environment where acting on it meant going against Miller, and going against Miller meant friction, and friction meant cost, and the calculus she had been running implicitly for 4 years in this building was that the cost of friction was always higher than the cost of looking the other way. That calculus was wrong. She had known, on some level, that the calculus was wrong for a long time, and she had not let herself know it fully, because fully knowing it would have required action. She went back to work every morning. She processed the documentation correctly. She supervised correctly. She had always been good at the job in the ways that are measurable, and she continued being good at them. But she had also, in the months since the letter of reprimand, started reading the posted passenger rights notices when she walked through the secondary inspection areas. All 6 bullet points, including the 4th one. It was the least she could do. She was aware that it was the least she could do. She was doing it anyway. Insert at end, before final stinger. Reyna's reflection. There were nights, in the months between the operational conclusion and whatever was coming next, when Reyna thought about the room. Not with regret. She had nothing to regret in the way the room was handled. She thought about it the way you think about a completed thing that had a cost and produced a result and is now part of the permanent record of what happened. She thought about the weight of 2 hours in a hard plastic chair, the buzzing light, the specific quality of silence that a room produces when everyone in it is performing a function they know is wrong and doing it anyway. She thought about Harold Osei, about his 9 hours in a hotel, his 11-page statement, his 6 months of consideration before the settlement, about the 3 names he had listed at the end of his initial statement, the beginning of a list that had become 23, and what it had cost each of those 23 people, missed connections, lost contracts, the particular tax on time and peace of mind that comes from being held in a room for 97 minutes without explanation, and that no settlement's acknowledgement paragraph would fully account for. She thought about Yolanda Reese and her notebook, about the fact that Exhibit R existed because a 26-year-old officer with 8 months on the job had decided, without being asked, that the true record mattered, that the distance between what officially happened and what actually happened was worth the cost of documenting it. She had started the notebook on her second week, and she had carried it every day since. That was the thing about accountability that was hardest to explain from the outside. It did not come, primarily, from the investigations, or the hearings, or the federal findings. It came from the accumulation of individual decisions made by people in rooms, whether to write something down, whether to say a name correctly, whether to stand up when they would have rather stayed sitting. The infrastructure of accountability was built from those decisions, one, by people who were not assigned to build it. Raina had spent her career in rooms that were designed to make a person feel like there was no record, no witness, no one on the outside who would ever know what happened inside. And she had spent the same career learning, over and over, that there was always a record, if you were willing to make one. The record was made. What happened next with it was not in her hands. That was the part you had to make peace with eventually. The part you had to accept in order to keep doing the work. That you could document the thing, you could establish the chain, you could carry it into every proceeding that would receive it, and then you had to let go of the outcome, because the outcome was not yours to hold. It belonged to the institutions, the hearings, the juries, the appellate panels, the journalists and the civil rights attorneys, and the junior officers with notebooks in their breast pockets. To everyone who picked it up after you and carried it the next distance, you passed the baton. The race was longer than any one person's run. She closed her laptop. She put on her coat. She went home. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous and full of rooms where things were happening that no one was writing down yet. Someone would write them down.